let's return to Samuel. And we left off in the middle of chapter 14. Just to remind you what's going on, we are, if you recall, we have a series of events having to do with Absalom that are really creating a serious decline and deterioration in what's going on in David's home and in David's kingdom. So, and really, it kind of all starts with David and Bathsheba, which we remember he, went after her, brought her to him. You remember the whole story, and he had Uriah, her husband, killed, and ends up marrying her. But it's a nasty story. It's really a very, I would say, the lowest point in David's behavior. Someone who's so righteous, and yet he gave to this. And if you may recall that at that point, when Nathan comes to him and rebukes him and helps him to understand what he did wrong, he says the following, and I'm now reading from 2 Samuel chapter 12, verse 10. He says the following: "Therefore, the sword shall never depart from your house, because you spurned me." It's the prophet talking on behalf of God. "Because you spurned me by taking the wife of Uriah the Hittite and making her your wife. Thus said the Lord, I will make a calamity rise against you from within your own house. I will take your wives and give them to another man before your very eyes, and he shall sleep with your wives under this very sun. You acted in secret, but I will make this happen in the sight of all Israel and in broad daylight." Then we start in our chapter. We moved in chapter 13, we learned about this terrible story of Amnon, who rapes his sister, but his sister, because they have the same father, they're both children of David, but this Tamar is the full sister of Absalom. They share both a father and a mother. And then what happened, of course, is a terrible thing. So we see already this disintegration of the family of David's house, which is very much what Nathan is saying. It's going to come from your house, from your family. Things are going to start falling apart. So we have this terrible situation. After which, Absalom never forgives Amnon, and he ends up murdering Amnon. So now we come to a situation, we have two brothers. And imagine David, and this is what we discussed last time, David dealing with this horrific situation where one son has murdered the other. He's mourning the son who was murdered, but he's also mourning the son who murdered. And then Absalom runs away, which is an appropriate thing. He's in exile. But meanwhile, we have a situation at the end of chapter 13 where David is just not functioning very well because he's mourning over both children. And then Yoav decides he's going to get involved, and he sends this wise woman from Tekoa to speak to David, and she creates a story. She pretends, very similar to the way Nathan presented the issue to David, enabling him to understand how wrong he was in taking Bathsheba. It's a similar method. Yoav has this woman pretend she's a widow and who has two sons, and one son murdered the other. She tells the story to David, and she says, now I have a problem because the relatives want to take my other son and kill him and, execute him. Injustice, what happens to a murderer? He's executed, but then she's left with no sons. And so it's very much parallel to the situation that David is in. And through this, she is trying to make David aware of what her ultimate goal is. And it's not her goal, it's Yoav's goal. Yoav would like David to return Absalom. And he sees the fact that Absalom is still alive. David is still mourning over two sons. He feels, by assumption, we're assuming he feels that David is not functioning very well. He's also very depressed. He's very down. And perhaps if he brings the one son back who can still be brought back, that can help things. And that's the goal of this woman from Tekoa, acting on the behest of Yoav. Okay, so now let's start with verse 13, because this is where the woman, she tells the story, which is not true. It's a made-up story, but to set the stage, it's somewhat of a parable, okay? And now in verse 13, she's going to start helping David to understand that the story she told is not really about her, it's about him. Okay, so let's read that. Verse 13. And the woman said, Why then? Oh, here I have a problem with the translation. The translation I have says, "Why then have you planned the like against God's people?" When really it was what actually says in the Bible is, "Why did you think this way about God's people?" Okay, and let's read the whole sentence. Why did you think such about God's people? In making this pronouncement, your majesty condemns himself, and that your majesty does not bring back his own banished one. So here she makes it very clear that David had made a ruling, even though her other son, who the surviving son, is a murderer, he will protect him. He will remain alive. He will not be banished. Okay. And so what she says is, you ruled that way about my son, so to speak. Why aren't you ruling that way about your own son, who you have banished? Why aren't you bringing him back? But it's interesting here that he enters at the beginning of when she starts talking, she has this crazy, she brings in the people of Israel. Like, why is this relevant? She says, why did you think such about the people of Israel? And there's different ways of understanding, like, what does God's people have to do with this? But it's clear here that she's bringing in, I would say, public opinion. Okay, when you're doing this, why do you think that God's people would go along with this of you banishing a son? Okay, keep that in mind, because this will be a very relevant issue as we continue on the story. The relevance of all of this to the nation of Israel, or the relevance of all of this to the relationship between the nation of Israel and David and Absalom. Okay, so just keep that in mind. She kind of brings us in as a kind of a hint here, but it will be picked up afterwards. Okay, verse 14. We must all die. We are like water that is poured out on the ground and cannot be gathered up. God will not take away the life of one who makes plans so that no one may be kept banished. Okay, but what is she talking about here? Okay, God will not take away, we're in verse 14, right? God will not take away the life of one who makes plans so that no one may be kept banished. Okay, what is she's basically saying? That people die. Okay, they die. Yes, Absalom killed Amnon, but at the end of the day, people die. It's something that happens. So when that has happened, why are you doing it in such a way that you're banishing your son at the same time? Okay, it's kind of a convoluted way of saying that, but that's the basic idea. And the reason I've come to say these things to the king, my lords, is that the people have frightened me. Your maidservant thought I would speak to your majesty. Perhaps your majesty would act on his handmaid's plea. Here she says that before she comes to the king, she's still playing the role of the widow who lost the sons. Okay, she's not changed that. She's saying, this is my situation. This is how you ruled. Now you should maybe think similarly about how you've ruled with regard to Absalom and banishing him. So she says, now I'm saying these things, but people have warned me, have tried to tell me, you can't just go to the king and challenge him on what he's doing, how he's banishing his son Absalom. You can't do something like that. Okay. But she's saying, but your maidservant thought I would speak to your majesty. Perhaps your majesty would act on his handmaid's plea. So she's saying, and she hasn't yet said, I just told you a whole story that doesn't exist, but she's beginning to hint at, I came to you with this message, and I really believe that it's okay that I come to you with this message, even though all my friends said, you're crazy, you can't go and criticize the king. And then we'll continue, verse 16. For your majesty would surely agree to deliver his handmaid from the hands of anyone who would seek to cut off both me and my son from the heritage of God. So she reverts now to her role as talking about her son, and she reminds him that he pledged to protect her and to protect her son. And that's exactly, she's reminding him, that's what you said. But she says here something very different. She says at the end of 16, from the heritage of God. I'm not sure heritage is the right word here. In Hebrew, it is nachalah. Nachalah means inheritance, not heritage. Okay. And so here you have a reference of exactly what she talked about when she talked about her two sons. Okay. What did she say? She said one killed the other. Now, if the second one, the murderer, is also killed, one of her things that she says is she has no one then who will inherit her husband has died. Her husband's name will be cut off. It reminds us very much of the laws of the levirate marriage. Okay, when a woman who doesn't have any children and her husband dies, there's a procedure by which she will marry her husband's brother, and then the first child who's born out of that relationship will be considered the heir of the husband who died. Okay, so what is that? What is all that about? Because there's tremendous concern in the Bible and at this time that every man should have an heir. And when you talk about the territory of the inheritance of God, you're talking about the territory, the inheritance in Israel itself. Okay, we know that all of the nation of Israel have been divided up into tribes and then into families, and everyone is given a plot of land in the land of Israel. So when you have a situation of an inheritance being cut off, it's not just who am I going to give my rubies to, okay? It is who is going to, this piece of land that was dedicated, that was supposed to be the ownership of a particular family. If that family dies out and there's no continuation, it's not just that the name of the father won't have a continuation, but there's something going to be missing, absent in the territory of the of God. Okay, and that's what she's referring to here. And so she's kind of trying to pull all of this together, this idea of what will happen to her son, and she'll be relating it, of course, to Absalom as well. She's already hinted at that. And she's bringing in God, and she's bringing in the nation of Israel. She's trying to say, you know, there's much bigger things at stake over here, King David, okay? And then she continues. Your maidservant, verse 17, your maidservant thought, let the word of my lord the king provide comfort. For my Lord, the king is like an angel of God, understanding everything good and bad. May the Lord your God be with you. Okay, so now she basically delivers the punchline. And she said, look at what you said. You yourself, the word of God, you pronounced a judgment on what should happen with my sons. And you said the murdering son should be protected. So let that same word that you gave it bring comfort to you. For my Lord, and then she, gives them like an angel of God, understanding everything good and bad. She's basically saying, you judged right, okay? Now may the Lord your God be with you. And suddenly, David starts to figure out what's going on. Wait. What's she talking about? She's talking about her kids, or she's talking about Absalom. What is going on here? She's very clever because she drops hints in very unique, very, very planned ways, but she doesn't go all the way to say, you idiot king, bring back Absalom. She remains very respectful and a certain level of vagueness, but trying to convey the message. And then in reply, the king said to the woman, do not withhold from me anything I ask you. The woman answered, let my lord the king speak. The king asked, is Joab in league with you in all this? He suddenly suspects, this is not just an innocent woman. There's a plot going on here, okay? The woman replied, as you live, my lord the king, it is just as my lord the king says. Yes, your servant Joab was the one who instructed me, and it was he who told your maidservant everything she was to say. It was to conceal the real purpose of the matter that your servant Joab did this. My lord is as wise as an angel of God, and he knows all that goes on in the land. Then the king said to Joab, I will do this thing. Go and bring back my boy Absalom. In other words, she finishes her speech and he knows all that goes on in the land, and then she leaves. It doesn't say she leaves, but she's gone. She's finished. She has done her job. She was able to convey, even in this vague way, but she was clearly able to convey to David so that he understood that if he made a judgment in her case to protect the murdering son, that he has to act accordingly with his son as well. So he immediately turns to Joab and he says, I will do this thing. Go and bring back my boy Absalom. He's basically saying, I agree. You know what? You're right. Go and fetch him. Joab flung himself face down on the ground and prostrated himself. Joab blessed the king and said, today your servant knows that he has found favor with you, my lord king, for your majesty has granted his servant's request. Okay, now, I think that there's this, to me, when I read this verse, it grated on me. In other words, you would have expected Joab to say to David, oh, thank God, my master, you have agreed to bring back your son and you will find peace and the kingdom will be ruled better because your mind will be at ease, right? That would have been the normal response. But he immediately responds differently, and in a way perhaps reveals what is going on in Yoav's head all this time. He's what is he saying? Oh, thank God you listened to me. Now I know that I have influence. Now I know that you listen to me. Well, that's very self-serving. It's a very self-serving response on the part of Yoav, and it makes you wonder, what was Yoav's interest in all of this to begin with? Okay, was he really was he concerned about David? Was he concerned about Absalom? Or was he concerned about himself? Okay, so there's a few possibilities here. And here it makes you wonder, maybe he was concerned for himself. Maybe he sees this as an opportunity to increase his own power and influence with the king. So let's take a look at what we've seen so far. If we look at verse 1, okay, here we say, Joab, son of Truiah, could see that the king's mind was on Absalom. Here you get a sense that Joab is concerned for David, for his own peace of mind. And you get a sense also, maybe he's also concerned for the kingdom. Because maybe the fact that David is so obsessed with what has happened with Absalom is making him less of a good king. So at the beginning of this chapter, you have a very altruistic sense from Joab, looking out. But here, as I pointed out in verse 22, there's something else that's going on. And the question is, what does really Joab have in mind? Now, I don't know who it was, but I made a note of this months ago, okay? When we just first discussed the whole situation of David and Bathsheba. And one of you pointed out, and I would be thrilled if you could remind me who it was, and pointed out something very interesting. Yoav was there. Yoav was the one who David called upon to put Uriah the Hittite in the front lines. He was well aware that David was placing Uriah in a place to be killed. And he's never said anything to anybody. And one of you said, is it possible that in this story, Yoav is essentially extorting David? He's creating a situation, maybe extortion is too powerful or too strong a word. The idea being that he is kind of indicating to David, you better listen to me because I have something over you. And that could be what's going on here. And so I'm putting this out. Someone raised it and I said, let's visit that. And I'm reading these verses. I would never have thought of this before. But I'm reading this verse where he says, today your servant knows that he has found favor with you, my Lord King, for your majesty has granted his servant's request. Maybe this is a polite way of saying, today your servant knows that he has power over you, my Lord King, for your majesty has granted his servant's request. Now, I don't think there's any indication of in the text that that's what's going on. There's no clue, no hint anywhere that connects that, but it is possible. So which of you said this? Do you remember?
I think I said Joab had the evidence against him. Didn't he have it in writing? Therefore, he always had something against David, which he could keep in the future.
Right. So that was you, Allison, but this is where we could revisit that. I have no idea, but it's an interesting point. It's a very interesting point. Okay, so let's continue with the story. Okay, and Joab, verse 23, and Joab went at once to Geshur and brought Absalom to Jerusalem. But the king said, let him go directly to his house and not present himself to me. So Absalom went directly to his house and did not present himself to the king. So basically David has said, okay, I'm willing to bring Absalom back to Jerusalem, but I don't want to see him. I don't want any relationship with him. No one in all of Israel was so admired for his beauty as Absalom. From the sole of his foot to the crown of his head, he was without blemish. Look at this. No one in all Israel was so admired for his beauty. And I think this focus on no one in Israel was so admired by who? By Israel. We are setting the stage here for what happens next. Absalom is going to be leading a major rebellion against David. And we're setting the stage here. Now, it's very, very possible that from the moment that Absalom, again, we ask ourselves, what's Yoav's interest here? I think Yoav is loyal to David, okay? And I think Yoav is looking maybe after his own interests, maybe also after David's interests. I don't think he cares very much about Absalom, which is what we're going to see in these next few verses. But it is very interesting that Yoav plays into Absalom's hands. He sees what he's doing as helping David and helping the kingdom and maybe helping himself. But at the end, by bringing Absalom back to Jerusalem, Absalom enables himself to become so admired, so loved. Now, Absalom was a very handsome man. This is what we have here. And we're going to learn he has very long hair, and the long hair is going to catch him in trouble at some point later on. But we have a description not only of someone who is so good looking, but that the whole nation of Israel just looks up to him and says, wow, what a handsome man. So he's laying the stage here. Once he comes back, this is Absalom's plan. He wants to be in Jerusalem. Okay, he's not in the palace, but at least he's in Jerusalem where everybody can see him. He is no longer banished. When he cut his hair, he had to have it cut every year, for it grew too heavy for him. The hair of his head weighed 200 shekels by the royal weight. Absalom had 3 sons and a daughter whose name was Tamar. She was a beautiful woman. He named his daughter after his sister who had been raped. It is a way of saying, I killed Amnon, but it is not over. It is not over. Now, another thing that we can think about Absalom as we're going into what happens is that we don't see that David did a whole lot after this rape. Tamar's in a bad way. David does nothing. He doesn't punish Amnon. He doesn't go to Tamar and help her out. Nothing. He ignores the whole situation. He knows about it, but he ignores it. He knows about it, and he's also very worried when Absalom says, I want to invite all the brothers to join me for the shearing of the sheep. David himself doesn't want to go, and he's very reluctant, and finally agrees that the brothers can go. Why is he so reluctant? He must suspect that Absalom is going to try to do something to Amnon. Okay, but he does nothing himself. David is very weak. He's very strong with the enemies, right? He's very strong as a king. He's very weak when it comes to his sons and his family. And here we almost have Absalom saying, I'm naming my daughter Tamar because you, David, may have forgotten what happened to your own daughter Tamar, but I have not. And so it could be the part of the motivation of Absalom in what we'll see next is an ongoing resentment against David, that he did nothing with Amnon. And maybe he felt he had to do something because David didn't, which is, of course, caused all this problem. Absalom lived in Jerusalem 2 years without appearing before the king. He's banished from the court. Then Absalom sent for Yoav in order to send him to the king. But Yoav would not come to him. He wants Yoav, who is the chief advisor and chief of staff of the military, the most powerful person next to David. And he calls for Yoav because he wants Yoav to say to David, the same way that Yoav started the whole, Yoav was the one that enabled Absalom to come back from Geshur. So his assumption is, okay, I'm going to now call for Yoav to take me the one step further. I want to go to court. I don't want to be banished. I'm in Jerusalem, but I don't want to be banished from court. So he calls for Yoav, but Yoav won't come. And here you see a tremendous loyalty of Yoav to David. Okay, he may be self-serving to some degree, but he's still very loyal to David. He sent for him a second time, but he would not come. So Absalom said to his servants, look, Yoav's field is next to mine, and he has barley there. Go and set it on fire. This is the violent Absalom that we recognize from his murder of Amnon. And remember here, just like in murder of Amnon, he doesn't kill Amnon himself. He gets his servants to do it. So too here, he doesn't set Joab's field on fire himself. He gets his servants to do it. This is not a good guy, this Absalom. And Absalom's servants set the field on fire. Joab came at once to Absalom's house and said to him, "Why did your servants set fire to my field?" Absalom replied to Joab, "I sent for you to come here. I wanted to send you to the king to say on my behalf, why did I leave Geshur? I would be better off if I were still there. Now let me appear before the king, and if I am guilty of anything, let him put me to death." So what is Absalom doing? If we question whether Joab had some level of extortion or blackmail to David, but we didn't really see it, here is outright blackmail that Absalom does, using Joab and saying, he's acting like a mafioso, really. I burnt your field, you better do this. You don't do it, I'll burn your next field. I'll take your kids. I mean, he's really acting in this classic mafia kind of way. And of course, Yoav gets the message, and he says, and Yoav went to the king and reported to him, whereupon he summoned Absalom. He came to the king and flung himself face down to the ground before the king, and the king kissed Absalom. So here we have Absalom coming back. He's going through the motions. He flings himself before the king. He shows proper humility. He shows a sense of regret, perhaps, for what he has done. He's doing that through his flinging himself on the ground. And as a result, David kisses Absalom. But Absalom does not kiss David. What we have here is essentially Absalom setting the stage for the rebellion. What we see is that he already established himself as someone attractive that all of Israel is looking at him and says, "Oh, look at this handsome guy." But what he doesn't have is acceptance at court. And he attains that through this blackmail of Yoav. He then comes to court, and in front of everyone, I mean, court is a public place, David kisses him. He doesn't have to kiss David. He doesn't love David. He doesn't care about David. But by getting David to kiss him and welcoming him in court, what he accomplishes is now he is back to his original position. And that is the crown prince. He's the crown prince. Because Amnon was older than him. He got rid of Amnon. Now, we can assume that his real motivation getting rid of Amnon was to avenge the rape of his sister. But when he got rid of Amnon, he also got rid of the crown prince. Opens the way for him. And so what we're seeing now, we're going to see it, we're going to deal with this next week in chapter 15. We're going to see, full-blown rebellion and how it starts and what Absalom does and all the different steps he takes in order to cause David to leave the palace. But what we saw in this story is already laying the groundwork. And I would venture to say, not that Yoav had this in mind, and not that the Tekoite woman had this in mind, but by the very fact that the Tekoite woman mentioned this idea of what were you thinking of the nation of Israel, or the fact of bringing in God and the inheritance of God and bringing in the nation of Israel, you have a sense that what she's saying is, when you banished Absalom, you did an injustice to the nation because the nation loves Absalom. The nation does not want Absalom to be banished. And that's true. And we see that absolutely being carried out at the end of the chapter, how much they love him. And in a way, and I think not realizing it, I don't think Yoav realizes this. I don't think that the Tekoite woman realizes, but in bringing in the nation of Israel, and in this example, she creates a situation where there's this idea that Absalom is popular or should be popular, or that the nation of Israel itself has an interest in Absalom, which of course becomes a very important factor in the success of his rebellion. That's it for today. Any comments? But I don't have time for much because I've got to
Okay,
leave.
just
but
one
any comments?
comment. Is it possible that on David's part is not so much weakness like resolve? Because remember, Nathan had told him what is going to happen for his behavior. So I think he is resolved to the fact that God is doing these things to him. These things have to happen because of his behavior.
I don't know, because he doesn't tell him it's Absalom who's going to rebel against you. And
No, but he told him what's going to
happen.
happen to his family, you know.
He just
He
knows
didn't
things
know
are
which
going to fall
child.
apart. But
Yeah.
still, I think at the end, I don't know. I think in the end that David is weak because it's not just now, it's also before. He does nothing when Amnon rapes Tamar. And here we see the seeds of the rebellion. I don't think he believes that Absalom would rebel against him. He really doesn't. He's a bit naive, I think, when it comes to his sons. We understand it. We understand it, but sometimes as a king, you can't afford to be naive, even when you're talking about your own sons. And I think that's what I meant by weak.
Okay.
He has a weak in the sense he has a soft spot. We understand that. We have a soft spot for your sons. And so he doesn't necessarily see the extent to which there's real danger coming in from his sons.
Do you
Okay.
think perhaps
Thank
he
you.
feels,
Pardon?
do you think perhaps he feels unable to act because of what he himself has done? And he's so full of conscience for his adultery with Bathsheba that he finds it very difficult to remonstrate with Absalom for something which for what he's done with Tamar.
Well, I think that that's very possible. It's very possible. Yeah. I mean, we don't see a specific reference to that, but it's very possible.
Do you think, oh, and one other little point, Absalom had 3 sons, but they aren't named. And then if you go on a couple of chapters, you find that he raises a pillar because he says, I don't have a son.
And because he doesn't have children. Right. That's something we have to deal with later on. That's clearly an issue. And it could be raise the pillar before. And this is kind of like a summary verse about Absalom, even though he dies much later. Okay, so it could be that this is like a summary verse, and at the point at which he put up the pillar, he didn't yet have sons, and this verse is kind of summarizing his whole life. But that what we were going to deal. I was going to deal with that when we get to the pillar story. But the issue, I think, not naming the sons. I think the point here is to name the daughter. I think that creates a very important message on what's going on here. It's just one more thing that we can see as laying the groundwork for the rebellion, that there's a personal resentment of Absalom against David, that he did nothing when Amnon raped Tamar. Anyway, I really must go now. So if you have additional questions, mark them down, and then we'll continue next week. Okay.
Thank
Bye-bye,
you.
everybody.
Very much.
Enjoy your evening.
Thank you. Thank you so much.